أشهد لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. Assalamu alaikum. My name is Karim Azeez. Before I came in Islam, my name was Lawrence Lee Manley, from the family of Manleys over in the Chesapeake area. And then I chose the name Karim Azeez, and my mom gave the name to me, Lawrence. I use that as a middle name legally, so Karim Abdul Lawrence Azeez. I'm from a family of 15. Came in the community after I dropped out of high school back in 1969, and I took a bricklayer trade up in school. So when I got out of school, I had a cousin that had joined the Nation of Islam, and being I knew how to lay brick, he had, back then, teaching was do for self. And I had my cousin, he had, before coming into Islam, he used to work for bricklaying companies. And by the time I got out of high school, he had started working for himself. And he was in the Nation of Islam, and me working with him, he never asked me to come down to the mosque, but he would talk to me, that was it. I was then, although I had took up bricklaying, I was like a laborer for him. He worked out working out his car, doing little jobs, and I was the helper, and he was the bricklaying, although I had the trade until later on he built his business up, and then I ended up, laying bricks with him and with some of the other people that was working for him. And the daily talk with him, he always talked about Islam, and then our family was, was in the church, and I was in church every Sunday, but being back then, the meetings at the temple was like 1 o'clock. So I would go to church, although he never asked me to come down to the temple, but I used to ask a lot of questions. I would go back to the church and ask the preacher questions, especially about the eating of pork, and other questions, because back then it was things that the Muslim talked about, and I would go back and ask the preacher about some of them things, and sometimes he would answer, and sometimes he didn't have an answer for it, and things like the pork, he would say, well, just pray over it, before you eat it. The answer was just pray over it. Like that would make it okay to eat. But even then, and I was like, well, my common sense that elderly people with high blood pressure, they can eat it and pray over it and still would run their pressure up. So I knew that, and at the age of then 16, 17 years old. So I'm like, it's not making sense. And one of the basic teachers, like when I would visit the Nation of Islam, they would talk about how old Christianity was, and I would go back and ask the preacher about things like that. And some of the questions he was like he didn't know anything about it. So I'm like, well, I must, I told myself, I said, well, I must be in the wrong place. If it's questions he didn't know about, because you go back to to the temple, and they knew how old Christianity was, how old Voodooism was, and all like this. I'm like, but they got all the answers.
Right.
And here in the church, in the preacher, he was like, didn't have the answer, and the ones he answered, my common sense didn't allow me to even believe some of those things, you know. So, so that's what made me start going to the temple back then. And then before you could be a part of Islam, back then they would give you what was called a student enrollment before you could actually join. You have to learn a group of lessons, and then after you learn the lessons, you had to, they gave you some questions. The question was, the paper they gave you was the lessons on there. After you learn the lessons, you send them in, and then you will receive what they would call X. And what it is, like I was Lawrence, then I was like Lawrence X at the time. It was a Lawrence that was in the Marshad, so I became Lawrence 2X back then. And even before I could receive my X, coming out of school, I had dyslexia, a reading problem. I couldn't read. I was reading. I took up bricklaying because even in high school, I realized I was going to need something after getting out of school, because I went all the way up to the 11th grade and still hadn't learned how to read. So I took up a trade, although I dropped out the 11th year when the school opened for the grade, to go back for the 12th year. I went down and tried to join the Army, and I ended up having some, well, they said it was a murmur I had, so I wasn't able to go in the service. So that's what put me out in the field, out working and trying to do for myself. But ended up joining the Nation of Islam. What made me be able to get my X was I had one of my sisters. I would go to her, and she would help me do those lessons that you needed before you could write your letter. And after doing that, she ended up becoming Muslim and joining the Whichcall, and she was already grown and out of the house. She had brought her husband. I think back then she had like two kids. She, brought them all in, because I would go to her for her to help me do my lessons, the student enrollment, and the question was on there. And the question was, how old Islam, how old was Christianity, how much the earth weighed, things of that nature. Was back then, the schools that they had, was Sister Clara Muhammad schools, and they called them universities. So some of those things that they taught you, and they taught you those things for just coming in the Nation of Islam. It was teaching you things about the universe, how old the earth was, how much it weighed, how much the person's brain weighed, and it was a group of lessons you had to learn them even before you could get your letter to come into the Nation of Islam back then. And when you sitting off to get your letter, before you could get your letter back, it was intercepted by the FBI. Before you got that letter back, it was the FBI would intercept your letter. And the proof of that, because they would show up at your house. They would show up at your house or on your job. And I guess their thing was, they show up on your job, chance is later on you would have gotten laid off or fired. from your job. But being, like I was saying, I worked for my cousin, and he was already a Muslim, which he had told me the history of how they came on his job, and he didn't get fired because he was, a good bricklayer, making money for the man he was working for. But they did come on his job, and what they do, they'll come on respectable and ask the person you're working for, they introduce themselves as the FBI, and they'll tell you that, well, the person's chance is it's nothing he did, it's just that, we want to interview him. But on the same ticket, when they come on your job and they come there asking they want to interview a person, their common sense want to think that, well, he must have done something or done something wrong, and they don't want you working for them, and they standing back watching him and watching them too. And chances is they might be doing something crooked, so chances is you get laid off, and that was something that happened with a lot of people coming in the Nation of Islam back in them days. You would get, and same thing. If they couldn't intimidate you by coming to your job, the next thing they do, they show up at your house, and chances is your parents, if they have a problem with Islam or not, they either put you out the house, and you gotta go out for yourself. My parents was type of parents, they didn't think it was nothing I was doing that was wrong. They knew I was going down to the temple, and when they couldn't come on my job because I was working for my cousin that was a Muslim, they showed up at my house, and I the one answered the door at the time they came, and then I let my mom know that it was some FBI's at the door, and they wanted to ask me, said they want to ask me some questions. I invited her to sit down with me when they wanted to do the interview or question, and their question was, they realized I've been going down to the temple, and they just want to ask me some questions, and they were like, well, what it is, the thing was that they said they had been watching the Nation of Islam, and they want to know if I can answer some questions about Elijah Muhammad. And I'm like, well, I'm pretty sure if there's anything I know about Elijah Muhammad, y'all already know it. I answered them that way. I said, it's nothing about Elijah Muhammad that y'all probably don't already know about him, So it won't know a whole lot. They didn't go much further other than that, So I was like, hey, y'all know more about it than I know. I just started going at it, So, and that brought me, later on, like I say, it might have been several weeks, a month later, I received a letter back receiving, your act, because that was the procedure, the FBI, and it's probably right to this day, in the FBI files, they probably have in there where they had did an interview with me, trying to track, see if they could intimidate, because there's no other reason, because I had never, at that time, just like now, because I was just 17, going on 18, in the church, never drunk, smoked a cigarette, hadn't even got a speeding ticket. So, it was sure wasn't no reason for them to, being paid by the government for them to come be tracking me down, other than the problem they had with the Nation of Islam back in them days, So that put me, going to the temple back then. It was on Campbell Road. So by the time I got my ex, that was in the 70s. And it was on Campbell Road over in Norfolk, Virginia. And from there, they When I came in, we was there for about 3 or 4 years. And then after that, they moved from there to Church Street, the old movie theater. And that was from Camp Scholar, that was still under the leadership of Marshall X. And so coming over to Church Street, 74, 75, right around then, Imam James Shabazz ended up coming from New Jersey, and he moved down. Minister Marshall ended up going somewhere in Carolina and stayed on Church Street. Stayed another 4 or 5 years, and then from Church Street we moved over to 26th Street, and it was maybe on 26th Street for another 4 or 5 years, and from there we went to Benjamin Ridge. Lower Benjamin Ridge for maybe 4 or 5 years.
Where's Benjamin Ridge? Is that Norfolk?
Yeah, off Tower Drive, where they park, around back where the little playground park. Benjamin Ridge is like when you turn off Tower Drive. It's the street before you get to the park. You know, if you turn at that light and go down one or 2 blocks, but in the park is another block or 2 away. But it was there on Benjamin Ridge for about 4 or 5 years over there. And from when we shut down there, community kind of had a little split from there and went to, some went over Newport News, Azeez there, and a few others. We started a meeting right across the street from here, over at Sister Jackie, on top of her store over there. And pretty much we've been here now ever since then. Yeah. So put us.
So you were here for the transition in about 78.
Right. Had made the transition on Church Street.
On Church Street when the transition.
On Church Street when the transition came about.
So how was that? Was that like a big change? Was your praying the same, doing everything?
No.
I heard that fasting was on different times or something like that. Was it a big change or?
Back then, you fast once a month. It was like a 3-day fast.
Okay.
Once a month you did a three-day fast, and then during the Ramadan you would do the whole month fast. Back then. But yeah, it was on Church Street around the time that James Shabazz came in. That was around the time the transition kind of
so when he came is around the time of transition.
Right,
okay.
yeah, he was here at the time of the he changed over from the Nation Islam to the World Community. We went from the World Community Islam before we took on the name Nasir Williams Salam.
Okay.
So a couple of names Imam Wafi Muhammad used, and then he started saying each masjid was autonomous, meaning they were on their own. And so back then that's when we took Nasir Williams Salam, which was named after a brother that was, I don't know if he had just passed, but then he was one of the ministers in the masjid, and that's why we took on Masjid Williams Salam.
You knew him?
Yeah, he was in the community. He was already in the community when I came in on Camp Scholar Road. So he was in from, he had already been in in the 70s. Yeah, back then.